Du coup, on est très heureux de vous voir si nombreux et nombreuses dans ce bar, parce que nous avions vraiment à cœur de tenir cette plénière sur l'impérialisme. À l'heure où l'hégémonie des États-Unis est contestée par la montée en puissance de la Chine, des guerres éclatent partout dans le monde. Les États-Unis sont en guerre en Ukraine, en réponse à l'invasion russe, et on peut douter que l'adhésion de l'Ukraine à l'OTAN ou l'exploitation de ses ressources stabilise la région. Ils sont en guerre en Palestine, mais aussi dans toute la région, en soutien inconditionnel avec Israël. Les États-Unis remplacent la France dans ses anciennes colonies, et particulièrement au Sahel, accueillant dans leur base, notamment le camp Le Monnier, les soldats français déchus. Ce matin, dans le panel sur l'impérialisme français, un camarade a rappelé que ce sont les bases françaises d'outre-mer qui délivrent de nombreux renseignements aux États-Unis lorsqu'ils bombardent, et notamment ce fut le cas du bombardement de l'Iran. Cette solidarité transatlantique s'exprime aujourd'hui avec le plan de réarmement de l'Union européenne de 800 milliards d'euros, élevant les dépenses budgétaires des États à 5%. Bon, en réalité, on est plutôt à 3,5% du PIB. Un chiffre qui n'est pas anodin, car c'est celui qui est réclamé par le gouvernement américain de Donald Trump. Ce dernier s'en félicite, car il y voit une opportunité pour vendre encore plus d'armes. Mais heureusement, la lutte contre l'impérialisme s'organise. Le week-end dernier, un grand meeting contre la guerre a eu lieu au Bourget, en même temps que le contre-sommet de l'OTAN à La Haye et la grande manifestation contre la militarisation à Rome. Je m'arrête là pour donner la parole à nos invités. Dans l'ordre, Costas Lapavitsas, qui est économiste à la SOAS Université à Londres, qui travaille particulièrement sur la monnaie et l'intégration de l'Europe dans le capitalisme américain et la financiarisation de l'économie. Il était aussi député en Grèce avant la trahison de Syriza. Ensuite, nous entendrons Ingrid Kvangraven, économiste au King's College à Londres, qui va proposer une actualisation de l'école de la dépendance pour comprendre les relations centre-périphérie. Ensuite, nous aurons le plaisir d'écouter Claude Serfati, qui est économiste à l'IRES, donc Institut de recherche économique et sociale, qui a beaucoup travaillé sur l'impérialisme français et qui est membre du conseil scientifique d'Attaque. On avait aussi prévu Rami Shahat, qui s'excuse de ne pouvoir être présent parmi nous. Du coup, Costas.
Good evening, comrades and friends. I cannot speak in French. I can read French very slowly. And I might even understand French if you speak slowly. But I cannot speak it. So I'll speak in English. But, yeah, I'll speak in English and I'll do my best not to get too excited, because I'm Greek and I get excited, and then when I get excited I speak very fast. So if I start speaking very fast, ask me to slow down. Okay? Now, I was asked to speak on imperialism today. And I want to say at the outset that the capitalism of our day right now is characterized by an extraordinary acceleration and exacerbation of imperialist contests in ways that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. Imperialism, therefore, calls for analysis and understanding from a Marxist perspective, and so does the battle for hegemony. Hegemony and imperialism are not the same thing. So this is a prime task, analytically and politically, which is why I'm pleased to be here in this audience among Marxists to discuss it. What I will present to you is work that I have been doing with a team in London. Some of this work will appear in Socialist Register next issue. Now, in summary, what I will say is that the intensification and exacerbation of imperialism today brings to the fore the main imperialist presence and the main aggressor, who is the United States of America. And it is the main imperialist presence and the main imperialist threat to peace and to the world. I will explain why that is, but I will also point out that this position, this stance of the United States of America comes out of weakness. It doesn't come out of strength. It comes out of weakness, and it comes out of a perception of threat to its hegemonic position. So it is a reaction, it is an aggressive reaction to a transforming world. And I want to point out why that is the case and how it is the case. I also want to say that this expression of economic and political behavior on the part of the United States of America primarily expresses itself as militarism spreading across the world and as domestic oppression as well. Domestic oppression, authoritarianism in the United States and elsewhere. These go together. It is the capitalism of our time. Now, I don't have very much time available to me, so I will get on with it in terms of the primarily political economy of it, but also the politics. Why weakness? The Marxist theory of imperialism, as we have it from the classical Marxists, Hilferding, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and so on, is distinct from other theories of imperialism because it connects the geopolitics, the politics, and the military dimension of imperialism to the economics of it. And not to the economics of it in the sense of one country has a benefit from another country and exploits another country. This is obvious. But to the economics of it in terms of the behavior of capital, the fundamental units of capital. This is what makes the Marxist theory of imperialism distinct. Otherwise, it's yet another condemnation of imperialism, and there are many of those. So, in that regard, and without going into the history of the theory of imperialism, coming straight to now, what I want to say is that the imperialist, the intensification of imperialism that we see now really began to take shape after 2009. It's an outcome and a phenomenon that we observe in contemporary capitalism after the great global crisis of 2007-2009. That crisis, it was a historic event, was a regime change event, after which we observe many phenomena in economy and society, and we observe the intensification of imperialism. Why? Now, I can speak for long on this, and I will not. The characteristic aspect of that crisis, for me and people I'm working with, is that it signified, captured and symbolized the peak of globalization and financialization. The two trends that characterized global capitalism since the 1970s. If you look at the phenomena of global capitalism, you obviously will see globalization in the sense of a spread of productive capacity across the world, and financialization in the sense of spread of finance across the world and spread of finance domestically. Obviously, we often talk about that time in terms of neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is an ideology and a set of economic policies. It isn't a period. the period is globalization of capital and financialization of capital. The peak of that came with the crisis of 2007-2009. After that period, after that crisis, the 15 years since then have been years of continuing globalization, continuing financialization, but without dynamism. It's been a period of, in a sense, weak performance of capitalist economies, capitalist accumulation. And that is the characteristic feature of the last 15 years. That is really what drives global capitalism in the West at any rate, the main parts of it in the last 15 years. For the United States, which obviously was the dominant capitalist country and presence throughout, obviously, the period since then indicates, since the crisis, indicates a strongly contradictory position. And I want to explain that. The United States remains the dominant force economically in terms of globalized capital. When you look at globalized capital, in other words, when you look at the enterprises, the big business of capitalism, in production, but also in finance, United States multinationals, United States banks, United States investment funds are top. The largest number of these global big businesses are American. They have an interest in dominating the globe, in unifying and dominating the globe, because that's what globalization and financialization is. At the same time, however, if you look at the United States as a national entity, because national entities also exist in the world market, if you look at the United States as a national entity, as a country, it's no longer dominant the way it used to be. It has subsided. It has retreated. It is not as big and it is not as dominant when it comes to size of economy, when it comes to growth rates, when it comes to profitability, when it comes to wage, productivity, and so on. So the United States faces a contradictory situation, and this characterizes the Trump administration. That is the problem that Trump faces. Because Trump wants to return the United States to a dominant national position, wants to make America the greatest again, but he comes up against the dominant position of the US enterprises. One doesn't fit the other. Measures that you take to restore the greatness of America as a national entity contradict the interests of American big business. This is a problem that Trump faces and he will continue to face. This is the situation, the contradictory situation confronting American capitalism in the 15 years since the Great Crisis. That's why we've called it, in the work we've done, an interregnum. It's a period in which capitalism doesn't go anywhere particularly with a clear direction. Now, I can speak for longer on this, but again, I will not. I will sum it up for you quickly. So the United States is in this position, which is very difficult for it, for its capitalist class, for its ruling bloc. But where does the challenge come from? Because if it is a difficult position, and if it is retreating as a national entity, if it doesn't have the strength it used to have as a national entity, although its businesses are very powerful, where does the challenge come from? The challenge doesn't come from Europe. And that is the most strange, the most striking historical peculiarity of the period. The old imperialist powers, France, Britain, Germany, the historic imperialist powers, are not challenging the United States. They are subordinate to the United States even today. We don't know how long they will remain so, but that is clearly the case as far as global politics is concerned. The challenge comes from what used to be the periphery of the world economy. The challenge comes from China, it comes from India, it comes from Brazil, it comes from Russia, it comes from a whole host of countries, mostly the BRICS, but not only. Because as globalization expanded, as financialization expanded, independent centers of capitalist accumulation emerged in what used to be the periphery. There are many reasons for that, but One key reason is, of course, globalization of capital. It's yet another contradictory outcome of the globalization of capital. This is then the challenge that the United States faces. But that doesn't mean that it is in retreat. And I want to explain what the position is right now, because it's important to understand. When we look at productive capital, in other words, making of things, the foundation of capitalism, industrial capital, when you look at that, the United States has lost the competition. China is the workshop of the world. Manufacturing capacity and industrial capacity in China is as big as the next 10 countries put together. There is no competition. When you look at trade, until COVID hit, the United States was still at the top, the biggest trading power. No longer since COVID. China is a bigger trader, imports and exports, and, in a sense, a thicker trader. It trades with more countries. More countries have got transactions with China than the United States. So commerce is no longer dominated by the United States. Production and commerce are dominated by China. Finance, however, is a different story. Finance is dominated by the United States. Big financial enterprises, banks, pension funds primarily, investment funds are primarily United States capitalist outfits, and the global mechanism is dominated by the United States. The power then of the United States as a capitalist presence and as an imperialist presence comes from its ability, first, to set the terms through which competition takes place, to set the terms of investment, to set the terms of capital movement, to set the terms of trade. And the contest is about that. Who will dictate those terms? And the second source of strength for the United States is the dollar. Because international finance, but also international production and international trade need global money, world money. And world money is the dollar. And the country that dictates world money is the most powerful country in finance and elsewhere. That is US power. The power to dictate the rules of finance and the power to manage the dollar are the main economic strength of the United States in the battle of hegemony and in the battle to defend its imperialist presence. That is where competition takes place, and that's what's at issue with the competing powers. Because production and trade, no competition at the moment. That does not mean, and I haven't got time to spend much time on this, that does not mean that the United States can have it all its way. It has enormous financial power. It uses it. It weaponizes the dollar. It weaponizes the rules of finance to defend imperial interest. But it doesn't have it all its way. Why? Because production is no strongest. Trade is no strongest. So the United States has an enormous debt. A vast accumulation of debt, which might undermine the dollar. We can discuss that later. But still, at the moment, that's the main source of economic power and imperial power for the United States of America, and that is what it uses. Confronted with this, the United States has got no qualms in using it in the most aggressive way. The last element of strength, however, beyond economics, is of course military predominance. Imperialism is never just about economics. Imperialism comes from economics, but it translates into political and military power. Because if it doesn't, then it's not imperialism, it's just business. The United States draws imperial power from its dominance in finance and money, and it uses it to buttress its military power and to draw strength from military power. The United States of America, at the moment, has got roughly 1,000 military bases across the globe. China has one. There is no competition in military presence. The United States of America spends well over $1 trillion a year on weapons, most of it to sustain the bases. China spends 250, 260. Russia spends 140, something like that, depending, because a lot of it is secret. The United States of America is the main military power, the main spender, and uses military power together with economic power in the most aggressive fashion. No qualms. This is a power that doesn't negotiate. It sets its terms, and if you don't comply with them, it bombs you. That is imperial power expressed in the most uncompromising way. Now, 2 more points and I'm done. This presence, globally, comes together with domestic repression and domestic authoritarianism captured by Trump. Trump is the clearest demonstration of this. Domestic authoritarianism and domestic repression goes together with this intensification of imperialism. We have a hollowing out, an emptying of democracy as a real lived experience of working people, and the silencing of all opposition, the silencing of voices that might challenge this intensification of imperialism and this threat to world peace. And nowhere is this more obvious than when it comes to the Middle East, which is why we're here. Nowhere is this more obvious than when it comes to Israel and Palestine, where we see precisely an example of this intensification of imperialist presence, an intensification of imperialist intervention, and the silencing of all voices that might point to the actual reality of why we're there. What is the role of the West, and what is the role of imperialist powers in causing this? That is how it's going to be. It's not going to get any better. It's not going to get any better unless we make it better, because that's the logic of governance from the top. I want to finish by saying what I think the left should be doing on this. I don't want to go into the problems of the left, because we've discussed them many times, and I'm sure you know them better than me for France, much better than me for France. What I want to say is this. Confronted with imperialism as it is emerging now, and the hegemonic struggle, obviously the left must strive for an independent position. Clearly. We need a left-wing position, an independent position. We cannot align ourselves with any of these major imperial powers. It would be a mistake. Having said this, however, it is very, very important to understand that not all imperialists are the same. This is a long tradition in Marxist political economy and in Marxist politics. Not all imperialists are the same, because they've got different powers, as I've explained here. They're not ranked in the same way. For the left, therefore, as it seeks an independent position, it's very, very important to understand the differences among imperial powers and to position itself accordingly, to take advantage of the conflicts between them and of the tensions between them. And the left in developing countries understand this very well. The left in Europe maybe less well. But in developing countries it is understood immediately. If China is challenging the United States, then that creates space for the left and for others in developing countries and elsewhere. So the left then must position itself independently, understanding the differences between imperial powers and positioning itself accordingly. As it does that, it must strive for 2 key things: peace and no militarism. And in Europe, it's clear what this means. No to militarism, no to rearmament, none of this. Right? Peace and no militarism. And second, since imperialism is connected ultimately with the economics of capitalism, deglobalization and definancialization is the underlying economic message of the left. An economy and an economic activity globally, but also domestically, that shifts the model away from what we've lived through the last 40 years. That begins to talk about a socialist transformation of the domestic economy and a deglobalized and definancialized world internationally. It is very difficult. It is not simple, but that's the direction of travel if you wish the left to have an independent position that begins to connect with what ordinary people want. In other words, domestic socialist transformation in order to attain international cooperation and peace. This is as old as the revolutionary left. There's nothing new about it. It just re-emerges in a new way in our time. We've got to understand it and fight for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Costas, for those excellent remarks. Thank you, Marilyn, for the introduction. And thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm really impressed by the amount of Marxists in France. And solidarity with everyone who had to, go through all of the censorship that was happening the past few days and all the reorganization that had to happen. I'm also very happy to be on this panel specifically, and with these great scholars. So we were asked to kind of give different frameworks for thinking about imperialism for our time. So I'm going to also, I think I agree with a lot of what Costas said, but I'll talk about it from like a slightly different perspective. So I'll talk first about what imperialism is from my view, and I want to contrast it a bit with Piketty, because I know your countryman, fellow national, is also talking about colonialism now. And I think, although of course his paper made me very angry, I think it's useful to look at how mainstream economists are thinking about colonialism and empire, and in order to also think about our position. And then I'll talk a little bit about how specifically imperialism manifests in terms of money and finance, and then some very, very brief thoughts on how to get out of how to break the imperialist cycle, I think is the title of this panel, which is the question that I have the least answers to. But nonetheless, I'll give some thoughts on that. So I'm starting from the premise that imperialism is a concrete way in which global value relations assert themselves. I'll get more concrete in a moment, but moving beyond this kind of economics politics divide that you often see in these debates about imperialism, I don't think we can understand imperialism by focusing only on states or interstate systems or multinationals, although those are also important expressions of imperialism. But we need to, as good Marxists, understand how surplus value production is organized at a global level, and how it's distributed. And then, in turn, think about how this compels states and corporations to act in particular ways. So I'll come back to some examples on that. And this is in line with a lot of Marxist work on imperialism that came after the Second International, when there was a move to move away from the political theories to more systemic theories, systemic determinations, without moving into kind of economistic territory. So I'm drawing on interpretations of the world economy that start from global value production and then move to consider how this manifests itself in different ways. And this kind of theorization can be seen in a lot of branches of Latin American dependency theory that see class relations as the most foundational, more foundational than the nation state, right? So imperialism expresses itself in a variety of ways, including how international institutions work, dependency relations, role of the US dollar, Costas already talked about this, currency hierarchies. And these are all important for understanding how capitalism works globally, as a totality, but also the particularly violent expressions that it takes in the global south. And I think understanding these imperialist expressions is also important for us to think about capitalism, not in a Eurocentric way that it's the same everywhere, but to recognize that there are particular ways that it manifests across the world. So coming back to Piketty and Nievas, his co-author, is interesting because they approach colonialism in a very narrow way. And I think the way that they approach it reflects a lot of the common understanding of imperialism being specifically about political coercion, right? That it's about force, political force. And I think the problem with this is that they have this understanding of capitalism that does separate the economic from the political. And there are lots of ways that this manifests in the paper. There's lots of examples of it, and it's very problematic. But the first is that they analyze colonialism separately from capitalism, rather than understanding that colonialism was also subject to capitalist logics in its time. And this is, a big debate in the literature. But the British state in the 1800s, of course, as Marxists know, was a capitalist state. And was compelled to support the appropriation of value abroad and capital accumulation domestically. And British corporations, often went abroad even before the state, right? And then the state came and provided legal cover, infrastructure, etc. So thinking about colonial transfers as separate from colonialism, as Nievas and Piketty do, doesn't understand this like close link between capitalism and colonialism. And the kind of the capitalist states trying to secure capital accumulation for their capitals and their territory, that was very, very clear if you look at history of colonialism. I think it's also very relevant for thinking about what capitalist states are doing today. So in this separation, when they separate capitalism from colonialism, they also narrow down imperialism to just colonialism, right? They set up a story of the world economy where imperialism is a thing of the past, rather than the classical imperialist colonial period of the late 19th century being one specific sort of manifestation of imperialism in a world economy that has always been predicated on imperialist hierarchies and exploitation. So this leads me to how imperialism manifests today. It's still with us, of course. It looks different now from the 1800s. It looks different from the 70s. I think we're still in a neoliberal period. I know there's a lot of debate now about, like, are we in a new period? Capitalism has spread, deepened. Public sector capacities across the globe, especially in the global south, have weakened. The strength of labor has weakened. There's less optimism about the role of the state as a radical progressive or even remotely anti-imperialist actor. And of course, maybe the most obvious manifestation of imperialism today is that we can see in the world is the genocide happening in Gaza, supported by the US. And as a lot of sort of Marxist Palestinian scholars, including Adam Hanye and others, have shown, the Israeli colonial occupation and the US support for Israel needs to also be understood in a geopolitical context of securing access to oil in the Middle East. So again, we can't understand this colonial imperialist violence and genocide somehow being like outside of capitalism. This is a part of the system. According to Nievas and Piketty, colonialism is over, and East Asia is the new manufacturing powerhouse of the world, right? The US is weak because it has a trade deficit, and they argue that basically Trump would like colonial transfers the way that Britain had to support the US deficit, but the rest of the world isn't willing to give it to him, so therefore there's a crisis in the US. So I think that this fails to grasp the fact that the US doesn't need this kind of coercive colonial transfers. Capitalism is organized in a way that allows US corporations to keep accumulating at a global scale, mostly without the support of colonial coercion, right? So although the US has a huge trade deficit, a lot of the imports to the US are in fact owned by American corporations. This is, Costas already touched on this as well. So seeing the US trade deficit as a source of weakness serves to mask the continued power of US capital in the world today. There is a bit of rebalancing in the global economy with the rise of China. The US empire isn't over, or even close to being over. I think, so Sean Stars has some good data on this, and I know others have also done some interesting work on this, on how the US firms profit from a lot of the production that's taking place in China. And it's quite good at demonstrating how US capitalists are still very dominant globally, and that China has integrated into US imperialism, basically. We have a dollar-based financial system that demonstrates the strength of the US empire and US hegemony. And there's no evidence of this being replaced yet. I know there's some volatility now with Trump doing all these crazy things, but even with Trump in power, the dollar remains strong. There's no doubt China has emerged as an independent geopolitical force. It's not simply a client of the US, even though it does serve the US capital interests in many ways. But this kind of new configuration also makes it easier to see that there isn't one state or a system of states that's controlling the global economy in a direct sense, right? So very briefly on how this relates to money and finance. According to Nievas and Piketty, again, they see that the only problem with the global economy today is that the US has this, what they call the exorbitant privilege, which is what the mainstream economists also recognize that is something that the US have, this privilege that basically makes it possible for the US to borrow at lower rates because it has world money. But even while noting this unevenness, they don't reflect on why it has this exorbitant privilege, right? And Marxists have done a lot of work on this and how the development of the US as a capitalist hegemon goes hand in hand with the development of the US as world money, right? So again, it's important to not separate the financial from the productive or create this false dichotomy. US financial dominance is linked to its dominance as a capitalist power more generally. These are connected, right? So trying to reform only the financial elements of empire won't take us very far. It's also important to think globally here. The world market has always been a space of rivalries, hierarchies, imperial domination. The financial system is part of this. It's part of the hierarchical world market. It's not a national entity that can be regulated or analyzed at only the national level. Tony Norfield has done some really interesting work on this in terms of thinking about the City of London, as I'm sure some of you know. And then within this, global financial system where the US dominates and US finance dominates, there's been an asymmetric integration of countries of the global south into the international financial system, which manifests in the form of high borrowing costs, recurring debt crises, broader mechanisms of value appropriation, including through financial channels. And these are all different ways that reinforce and deepen global inequalities, but it's important to keep in mind that they're expressions of global imperialism or a global imperialist system rather than the root causes themselves in terms of thinking about what we put our energy into analyzing and challenging. Which brings me to the final question, which was how to break the cycle, which is a very hard one. And my main, leading from the theoretical framework I laid out in the situation today, I think anti-imperialist struggle has a very important role to play, especially when it's mobilized as an entry point to challenging class domination, right? And I want to contrast with Piketty one last time, because their policy recommendations, are limited to problems in the sphere of exchange. It's about prices, managing prices, cost of borrowing, financial transfers, taxes on surplus countries, better managing currencies. They also have some more progressive policies in their paper that are about challenging the governance of international financial institutions like the IMF, including voting rights, more voting rights for the Global South. And well, these kinds of reforms, of course, could be welcomed by Global South countries. There's little reflection in the paper on the political economy of these institutions and the power that underpins their attempts at reforms of these institutions. And I think actually their paper reflects an economics discipline that serves to mask power dynamics, actually, and they serve to mask the power dynamics that lead to the outcomes that they're trying to study. So this is what the economics discipline does. There's a kind of imperialism apology in their paper, which reflects something deeper about the discipline itself. I don't know if many of you care about the economics discipline, but that's something that I've been doing some work on with colleagues Devika Dutt, Carolina Alves, and Serbi Kezar on decolonizing economics. So the issue is that the evolution of international financial institutions and the rules set by them are themselves shaped by imperialist capitalist dynamics. So I want to briefly mention a paper I'm working on with Maria Dievik-Estiva and Paul Gilbert on the new international economic order to demonstrate some of these points, which the critique applies to Piketty and Nieves, but also to some of the NIO issues. Because the interesting thing about the NIO is that it was partly inspired by radical anti-imperialist Marxist thinking. But if we start from a radical anti-imperialist Marxist point of view, we can also quickly identify the limits and the problems of thinking that something like the NIO could actually challenge imperialism. So what's the problem with these kinds of reform attempts, let alone Piketty's? So the issue is that social relations are global, capitalism is global, and the NIAO reforms always privilege the nation state and the international system over class struggle. Third world states were also operating within global capitalism and contributing to reproducing capitalism as well. Interstate systems like the UN, the World Bank, are reflections of uneven development, and initiatives like the NIO that propose to reform the system through the UN only address the symptoms of uneven development, and given that they're working through that system that they're trying to reform, they're unlikely to be successful. So the US dominates international institutions because of its power globally. So trying to reform those institutions within those, the institutions themselves isn't, likely it's not possible to reform away the dominance from within. And the final critique is that the failure of the NIO was also related to the profitability crisis of the 70s that we're still kind of seeing the effects of, which foreclosed the possibility of redistributionist, welfarist type agendas. The problem is also that the NIO was guided by progressive internationalism, which is about changing the rules of the system, rather than revolutionary internationalism, which is about changing the system itself. And for me, that's what anti-imperialism is about. A revolutionary internationalism is much more likely to come from workers, social movements, radical organizations, and alliances, rather than the state or interstate systems. Those kinds of alliances are much more likely to link anti-imperialism to challenges of class domination and to the capitalist system itself. Those are the alliances and forces that are most likely to be able to break the cycle of imperialism. Thank you.
Bien, merci aux organisateurs, c'est remarquable succès de ces journées, et merci pour m'avoir invité à ce panel. Je commencerai par décrire rapidement ce que je comprends du sommet de l'OTAN qui s'est tenu à La Haye il y a quelques jours, qui marque 3 points pour moi. Premièrement, l'engagement de dépenser 5%, ce qui est en fait peu réalisable. Les États-Unis n'ont jamais dépensé en moyenne plus de 4% du PIB pour leurs dépenses militaires depuis la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Mais je n'ai pas le temps de commenter ce point, mais c'est très important cet engagement de militariser un peu plus l'économie et les sociétés. Deuxième enseignement du sommet de l'OTAN, c'est l'enthousiasme qui a déferlé pour féliciter Trump sur le bombardement de l'Iran. Donc, un pays qui a la bombe atomique comme Israël peut bombarder un pays qui n'a pas la bombe atomique selon non seulement l'Agence internationale de l'énergie, mais également le département de l'intelligence, enfin de la surveillance des États-Unis. Un bombardement qui parachève en quelque sorte l'explosion de ce qu'on a appelé le multilatéralisme. Et puis, le troisième point important, c'est en anglais « Ironclad Commitment to Enshrine Article 5 of NATO ». En français, l'engagement de respecter l'article 5 de l'OTAN qui dit que toute agression contre un pays serait immédiatement suivie par la solidarité et la réponse de l'ensemble des pays. Je ne disserte pas ici, je ne discute pas ici du degré auquel Trump est prêt à défendre des pays qui seraient agressés, Trump lui-même étant prêt à occuper le Groenland, mais il faut comprendre que cet engagement a une signification. De tout cela, du sommet de l'OTAN, on peut conclure que l'OTAN, contrairement à ce qu'avaient expliqué Macron et d'autres, n'est pas en état de mort cérébrale, mais demeure ce que j'ai appelé le bras armé du bloc transatlantique, principalement américano-européen. Et il faut comprendre, je ne développerai pas longtemps, mais c'est très important, je l'ai fait ailleurs, il faut comprendre la place de l'Europe. Les pays européens se sont tous ralliés inconditionnellement à la demande de Trump. Mais il faut comprendre que cela participe, bien sûr, de l'acceptation et de la reconnaissance qu'il ne peut pas y avoir de défense commune européenne comme il y a eu une monnaie commune puis unique, j'y reviendrai éventuellement dans une minute, mais ça participe aussi de la nécessité pour les États-nations européens les plus puissants de se militariser. C'est-à-dire que ce n'est pas simplement une soumission à Trump qui est organisée, c'est aussi la marche en avant du militarisme. Ce n'est pas un militarisme qui va aboutir à la défense commune, c'est un militarisme qui va stimuler, renforcer les systèmes militaro-industriels nationaux et en particulier ceux des plus puissants. Il faut bien comprendre cette articulation pour ne pas tomber dans ce qui me paraîtrait être une erreur, de penser que les impérialismes européens seraient des impérialismes désormais subordonnés ou dépendants, quasiment colonisés par Trump. Il y a ce rapport de force qui existe, mais dans lequel les États-nations, j'y reviendrai, les États-nations les plus puissants d'Europe, continuent à avancer. Alors, nous sommes au bord du précipice, on l'a vu avec les différentes guerres qui se déroulent actuellement, mais nous ne sommes pas au bord du précipice à cause de Trump. Et de façon presque provocante, je dirais que c'est parce que nous sommes au bord du précipice que Trump a été élu. Je m'explique. Le Big One, comme disent les habitants de Los Angeles sur la menace du prochain tremblement de terre, le Big One, le gros, c'est la Chine pour les États-Unis. Le reste, c'est, je ne dirais pas secondaire, mais il faut sortir de l'idée que ça serait des obsessions d'aller chasser sur l'Iran, etc. C'est la Chine. Nous avons là l'émergence d'un impérialisme chinois, pour moi c'est un impérialisme, qui rivalise, qui aspire à concurrencer, non pas à dépasser, mais à concurrencer, et au moins à coexister avec l'impérialisme américain, et ça, c'est inacceptable pour l'impérialisme américain. Obama avait commencé à lancer la campagne en disant il faut pivoter vers la Chine. Trump a continué. Biden a continué. Il s'est appuyé d'ailleurs sur de nombreuses mesures, commerciales en particulier, qu'avait prises Trump. Tout ça, depuis 2008, la première élection d'Obama, n'a pas empêché en 2024 l'ascension économique, géopolitique de la Chine. Vous avez là une des raisons pour lesquelles, aux États-Unis, on ne pouvait pas élire Biden, un président qui s'était assoupi pendant son débat avec Trump, c'est-à-dire un président qui continuait la routine de l'agression contre la Chine, mais qu'il fallait effectivement quelqu'un qui casse la baraque, c'est Trump. Je crois que la relation entre les personnes comme Trump et la situation structurelle des États-Unis qui a été décrite précédemment est très important à comprendre. Bien sûr, Trump va accélérer le chaos, c'est évident, enfin, par son comportement. Mais ce chaos est le produit de cette situation qui est née à la fin des années 2000 et sur lesquelles je vais revenir dans un instant. Trump, c'est un Bonaparte. C'est un Bonaparte qui a tous les caractères d'un Bonaparte. Si vous avez lu, je vous invite à le faire, le 18 Brumaire de Louis Bonaparte par Marx, vous verrez comment il traite le personnage, le caractère, le comportement, la psychologie de ce pâle personnage. Il reproche même à Victor Hugo, disons, d'appeler Napoléon le Petit, parce qu'il dit qu'il ne comprend pas que Napoléon est le reflet de la situation du capitalisme français. Eh bien, je pense qu'il faut surtout éviter de tomber dans les pièges des médias qui aujourd'hui, des médias et plus largement, qui essayent de tourner autour du caractère de Trump, de son imprévisibilité, etc. Ce sont des traits de caractère qui sont évidemment indiscutables, mais le fil directeur, c'est que les États-Unis n'ont pas de stratégie de moyen terme autre qu'empêcher la Chine d'accéder au premier rang mondial d'ici la fin de 2020. C'est ça qui vertèbre la situation et le comportement de Trump, bien sûr le personnage ajoutant en quelque sorte à cette situation structurelle. Alors j'ai dit de façon un peu provocante, ce n'est pas Trump qui crée le chaos, c'est le chaos qui a créé Trump d'une certaine manière. Ce chaos, enfin c'est un terme que j'aime pas trop, moi je le décèle en quelque sorte en formation dans ce que j'ai appelé le moment 2008, c'est-à-dire cette conjonction, cette concordance exceptionnelle et historique de temporalité entre trois types de crises. J'emploie le mot crise faute de mieux, mais c'est pas très satisfaisant. À la fois une crise économique, dont Costas a déjà parlé, et dont le blogueur marxiste Michael Roberts qualifie de longue dépression, c'est-à-dire une situation où le capital n'est plus aujourd'hui capable et en mesure d'accumuler pour produire suffisamment de plus-value. une crise géopolitique, je l'ai dit, avec l'émergence de la Chine comme un impérialisme ascendant en quelque sorte. Bien sûr, les rivalités avec la Russie, je n'y reviens pas. Et puis, troisièmement, cette situation unique qui, elle, n'a jamais été produite dans l'histoire, où le capitalisme est lui-même confronté à ses propres contradictions physico-environnementales, c'est-à-dire ce qu'on appelle pudiquement la crise écologique. Vous avez cette conjonction de ces trois crises qui, encore une fois, ont chacune leur détermination, mais qui ont convergé à la fin des années 2000. C'est pour ça que j'ai, faute de mieux, appelé ça le moment 2000. Bien sûr, comme disent nos camarades anglais, il faut prendre en compte l'agency, le rôle des acteurs. Bien sûr, les printemps arabes de 2011, qui ont subi beaucoup de vicissitudes depuis 2011, ont été également un élément et doivent être pris en compte dans cette situation née à la fin des années 2000. Alors, je voudrais maintenant parler, disons, de l'impérialisme lui-même, sur lequel j'ai effectivement écrit un certain nombre de choses. Et en particulier me concentrer sur l'articulation qui existe entre les guerres de classe, les guerres intérieures, les guerres contre les producteurs, dont on veut faire produire plus de valeur, plus de plus-value, et les guerres inter-impérialistes. Ici, la définition canonique, on pourrait dire, c'est celle, j'allais dire hélas canonique, si on sait ce que c'est que le canon, le droit canon pour les catholiques. Ici, la définition canonique, c'est celle que donne Lénine lorsqu'il dit « Si on devait résumer de façon concentrée ce qu'est l'impérialisme, on pourrait dire qu'il est d'une part un capital financier monopoliste et d'autre part le partage du monde ». Évidemment, cette formule à laquelle j'adhère totalement est une formule qui a été, disons, mésinterprétée, pour ne pas dire mal interprétée. En effet, et là on revient à l'articulation entre guerre de classe à l'intérieur et guerre inter-impérialiste, en effet, le partage du monde a été modifié depuis 1914, la domination des États-Unis, l'existence d'un bloc soviétique, etc., etc. Et on a finalement déconnecté le capital financier monopoliste, qui représente directement la guerre de classe à l'intérieur, on l'a déconnecté des rivalités internationales, des rivalités inter-impérialistes, disons du partage du monde dont parle Lénine. On a vu, dans les années 80-90, un certain nombre de marxistes, que j'appellerais post-modernes, si vous voulez, peut-être un peu enivrés par le discours néoclassique qui nous parlait de victoire du marché, nous expliquer que les théories d'impérialisme étaient dépassées parce qu'effectivement, il n'y avait plus de rivalité inter-impérialiste. Je pense que c'était une erreur profonde qui pèse encore, qui a continué à peser et qui pèse encore, de pseudo-découverte que dans ces 15 dernières années, quelque chose qui nous semblait impensable avant s'est réalisé, ce sont les conflits guerriers. Non, ce n'était pas impensable si on acceptait un cadre d'analyse de l'impérialisme qui met au centre à la fois effectivement la guerre de classe à l'intérieur, mais les rivalités inter-impérialistes à l'extérieur. Je pense que pour comprendre l'unité qui unit en quelque sorte la composante nationale et la composante de rivalité inter-impérialiste, il faut repartir d'une phrase que je cite souvent, que les rapports sociaux capitalistes, bien sûr, que le capital, si vous voulez, c'est un rapport qui est politiquement construit, donc autour d'États-nations, et territorialement défini autour de territoires proprement dit. Si on regarde ce fil directeur, alors on peut comprendre que l'impérialisme qu'analysaient les marxistes avant 1914 a bien sûr changé de physionomie, mais que si on accepte que le capitalisme n'est pas devenu une classe transnationale capitaliste, que le monde n'est pas devenu un État transnational qui subjugue le monde, mais que par contre les rivalités nationales demeurent, alors on pouvait comprendre, y compris dans cette phase d'euphorie de victoire des marchés des années 90, et plus encore aujourd'hui bien sûr, que ces rivalités interimpérialistes dériveraient immédiatement, inévitablement, en conflit militaire et en conflit interimpérialiste. Je voudrais sur ce point citer ce que disait Jaurès pour expliquer cette unité. Jaurès, donc, c'était un socialiste qui était sûrement pas le plus marxiste des socialistes de la Deuxième Internationale, et qui disait, il résume à peu près ce que j'essaye de vous expliquer, et beaucoup mieux dans son style très 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 fleuri: la guerre économique et sociale des classes entre elles, des individus entre eux, dans chaque nation, suscitera des guerres armées entre les peuples. C'est de la division profonde des classes et des intérêts dans chaque pays que naissent les conflits entre les nations. Je pense qu'on tient là, bien avant les théories de l'impérialisme, cela c'était écrit en 1895, on tient là cette unité où le capital est constamment poussé à produire plus de plus-value et donc à se tourner vers l'extérieur. Je ne vous ferai pas un cours sur l'impérialisme comme tourner vers l'extérieur. Et pour vous convaincre, si je ne l'avais pas encore assez fait, qu'il faut tenir les deux bouts, en quelque sorte, de la dimension impérialiste. D'une part, le combat contre les classes à l'intérieur et les rivalités interimpérialistes à l'extérieur. Je voudrais citer cette phrase du jeune Marx, comme on dit, une phrase, disons, de 1843, dans laquelle il explique « Les bourgeois ont un intérêt commun, et cette communauté d'intérêts qui est dirigée contre le prolétariat à l'intérieur du pays est dirigée contre les bourgeois d'autres nations à l'extérieur du pays. » C'est ce que les bourgeois appellent la nationalité. Vous avez au passage défini l'utilisation du chauvinisme et du nationalisme par les bourgeois. C'est à l'intérieur, ils sont unis, et sur le terrain extérieur, ils sont rivaux. Bien sûr, c'est beaucoup plus nuancé que ça, mais je voulais signaler cette unité. Donc je voudrais dire, avant de conclure, que ce qui me paraît nécessaire pardon si je suis un peu théorique maintenant, sur la caractérisation de l'impérialisme, c'est de bien garder en tête cette phrase que Marx a dite, à savoir « le marché mondial est inclus dans le concept de capital ». Et ça, c'est une phrase qui est à la fois d'une richesse extraordinaire, mais qui a été tragiquement interprétée à partir des années 90 par les marxistes comme une confirmation que Marx avait raison, puisqu'il avait été capable de prévoir la mondialisation. Et de ce fait, on a glissé sur une mondialisation qui était économique, financière, mais qui n'était pas militaire. Je propose, je ne développerai pas ici théoriquement en conclusion, mais je le fais ailleurs, je propose de dire que si le marché mondial est inclus dans le concept de capital, la fragmentation nationale est incluse dans le marché mondial. C'est-à-dire, je propose de revenir à Marx pour montrer que l'impérialisme, ce n'est pas l'économie, capital financier monopoliste, auquel les marxistes ont rajouté à l'époque la violence, les rivalités, le partage du monde, mais qu'on peut trouver chez Marx, et il faut trouver chez Marx, le fait que le marché mondial est de façon inhérente construite comme un marché fragmenté nationalement et qui donc provoque tout ce qui peut se passer du point de vue des guerres et des affrontements militaires. Je voudrais juste conclure maintenant, un peu moins brillamment que l'ont fait mes camarades, sur l'action, entre guillemets, quoi, hein. Je partage ce qui a été dit sur le fait qu'il faut que nous ayons une politique indépendante, mais je pense que politique indépendante, ça veut dire partir des besoins des peuples et de la défense des peuples. Je pense par exemple que, bien sûr, sur la Palestine, il n'y a pas de problème, mais que le droit du peuple ukrainien à résister contre l'impérialisme russe est quelque chose de vital. Nous ne pouvons pas reprocher, et à juste titre, aux dirigeants impérialistes européens leur double standard et adopter nous-mêmes, je ne fais référence à personne bien sûr, un double standard en ce qui concerne la situation en Palestine et la situation en Ukraine. De l'Ukraine à la Palestine, comme disent nos camarades ukrainiens, l'occupation est un crime. Je pense que c'est très important, à partir de ce fil directeur, bien sûr, toutes les tactiques sont possibles, d'utiliser les contradictions entre les différents impérialismes, sous-impérialismes, etc. Mais je voulais dire quand même que l'impérialisme russe aujourd'hui est un impérialisme dont il faut tenir compte, qui participe également au chaos dont j'ai parlé dans cette intervention. Merci.
Je vais faire passer le micro pour les questions. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions, des remarques?
Hi, thank you for your talks. I have a question for the two first speakers. So, first of all, if I'm here. So first of all, on the question of the U.S. deficit, so the U.S. has been operating on a deficit for a long time. It's like, I think, 40, 50 years or something. And I think they were able to weaponize it really well in terms of, real estate and financialization of everything. So why is it now a problem, right? So why all of a sudden now in 2025, the deficit has become a problem and it's supposed to weaken the dollar? Thank you.
Yes, thank you a lot for the talks. They were very informative. I want to ask a question, so sorry it won't relate exactly what you said, because I think you gave a very good overview of the situation, and I couldn't follow the last speech in French very well, so I'm sorry if that was mentioned there. But what I think you, Ingrid, mentioned towards the end of your talk about how the opposition to imperialism has to be based on being against class oppression, so it should be sort of from the class struggle basis. I'm wondering if maybe during a discussion of this panel we can talk a little bit about how we do it. So I come from the Netherlands, and last week we had the NATO top in the Netherlands, and my political organization organized a demonstration against NATO. We organized like an anti-top with anti-imperialist speakers, and it was quite well attended. I think it was relatively a success, but still, if you look at the polls, if you look at people voting for certain parties, you see the overwhelming majority of people in many European countries saying, yes, defense is one of the key issues right now. So this framing, it just really goes towards them, and honestly, I understand why it is like this, because people are afraid of war. So if they hear, okay, NATO is here to protect us, then they will support it. So I'm sorry, because I'm not sure if this panel is the place to discuss it, but how do we break this framing? Like, how do we reach people? And then, of course, we can say, like, yes, because of NATO, there are budget cuts in many sectors, healthcare, education, and so on. But I'm not sure if it really convinces people, because they're just really scared of the current situation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this panel. I had a question. I think it would both be a question for Costas and Ingrid. And I was wondering what you were thinking about Daniela Gabor's and Benjamin Brown's model of asset manager capitalism, and especially Ingrid, when you were saying change doesn't come from states. Their proposal for a big green state came to mind, and how do you, given your argument, and how would you say that this can or cannot counter imperialistic capitalism?
Merci d'être venu, merci pour les présentations, interventions. Dans certaines traditions, il y a une tendance de faire une sorte de distinction entre les différentes époques d'impérialisme. Comme si on considère l'impérialisme en tant que crise générale du capitalisme, il y a des différentes époques d'impérialisme, c'est-à-dire que en fait, d'exploitation impérialiste, c'est pas pareil dans différentes époques. Et puis surtout, Costas, tu as dit que c'est pas le même impérialisme que des années 70, et puis vous aussi, vous avez dit la même chose, j'imagine. C'est quoi la différence vraiment entre les années 70 et aujourd'hui? Et c'est une question plutôt stratégique, c'est-à-dire que en fait, la lutte anti-impérialiste, si on compare aujourd'hui les années 60-70, qu'est-ce que ça peut être quoi? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut penser en tant que perspective, comme par exemple dans les années 60-70, il y avait une tendance à porter la guerre à la maison comme de métropole impérialiste. Bon, je ne sais pas, je me suis bien exprimé, mais c'est ça. Merci.
I have a question about Piketty and Nievas. I agree that they, basically as far as I know, they are proposing something like Keynes proposed before Bretton Woods. And I agree that's a proposal which aim at correcting the symptoms of the system. But if you can elaborate why it's a bad thing to address the symptoms in the first place.
Ok. Peut-être qu'on s'arrête là, on fait une première salve de réponses aux questions. Ça vous va?
You want to go first?
I wasn't sure. Can you hear me? I wasn't sure how much economics to put into this when I was asked to speak. So it looks like I have to go, the full Monty. The classical theory of imperialism by Lenin, based on Hilferding, which is the canonical theory for Marxists, changed over time, but that's the canonical theory. Roots imperialism in the conduct of private capital, the conduct of corporations, and the conduct of banks. And the model that they have in mind is the continental European model, German and Austrian. That model basically said, big business, monopolistic business, as Lenin rightly called it, monopolistic big business controls production in heavy industry, means of production, machines to make machines. This is long-term investment, and if it is long-term investment, it requires long-term capital. The banks put the long-term capital in, and so the banks get locked into the business. If the banks get locked into the business, they control the business because they want to get the money back. And so what you get is Finanzkapital. In other words, you get a fusion and amalgamation, whereby the banks dictate the pace of accumulation and what business does. This type of capital, Lenin called the final phase of capitalism, because it comes from the roots of capitalist accumulation. That's the Marxist way to do it. That's what makes the Marxist theory different. Otherwise, you're like Hobson, you're like Norman Angell, you're like a whole host of other theorists of the time who decried capitalism morally, politically, ethically, all very nice, but it doesn't last. The Marxist theory comes from connecting it to capital. This particular capital that they talked about seeks special privileges for the export of goods and for the movement of money capital. It seeks territorial exclusivity. So it's colonial. Colonialism comes from the logic of this capital. It wants privileges in managing itself. And how do you get territorial exclusivity? You mobilize the state. So big business brings the state in. And how does the state get you territorial exclusivity? It gets guns, militarism. And so you end up with First World War. This argument by Lenin is simple, clear, powerful, and acted as political message for decades. It was Lenin. That's why Lenin stands out. Now, how much of this holds today? Very little. Why? First of all, there is no colonialism per se. There hasn't been any colonialism for decades. As in colonies, not control, not imperialist control. Of course, we've got imperialism, but we don't have formal colonies. And we haven't had as dominant presence. We do have leftovers, but we don't have colonialism. And we don't have territorial redivision of the world. Now, there have been many changes throughout the 20th century, for sure. The capitalism of today, which I refer to schematically and briefly, There's a different outlook. Why? The productive capital, the big business of Lenin's time, is monopolistic for sure, multinational enterprises, with a global presence. That's the difference, one key difference with Lenin's time. They produce across borders. They coordinate production, they create global value chains. They integrate different capitalists into the chain, but without property rights. So you can have a global value chain managed by an American business that brings Turkish capitalists in, or Thai capitalists in, and controls them, but without property rights. You don't have to own the whole thing. So you have a system whereby production is organized in this way globally. Globalization is that. Globalization of trade is an outcome of that, because 2/3 of international trade comes out of global value chains. It's big business trading with big business internally. So the production side looks like that. The finance side, again, doesn't look like Lenin's time. You have big banks, which operate globally, big investment funds that operate globally, but no investment fund and no bank tells Amazon what to do. Such a thing doesn't exist. It's not the dominance of finance capital over production. That doesn't exist. You don't have finance capital in the sense that you got it in Lenin's time, a fusion of those capitals with finance dominating. There is no bank that can tell Microsoft what to do. However, you do have globally active finance capital, globally active productive capital, and you have the pairing of these capitals that wants to control the world. That's the most aggressive pairing of capital in the history of capitalism. That's what drives imperialism. The economic foundation of that is these two forms of capital interacting with one another. What do they need? They need rules of engagement, in other words, investment rules, trade rules, getting your profit out rules, and that's the contestation. The state that gives them that is the hegemon. What else do they need? World money. I know, but I had to do the economics. What else do you need? World money. The state that gives them world money is the hegemon. Contestation is about that. The United States will not renege on that. And there is no state that can contest this. There is no state, other state that at the moment can provide world money. But they contest the rules. China contests the rules. That's the nature of hegemonic contest. That's what drives imperialism, in my judgment. That's how to understand it. I've got a lot more to say, but I know I've run out of time.
Do you want to say something about the room? Or? Okay, yeah. Apparently we have the room till 8:30, so we're going to be quick. So that was, I think Costas answered some of the questions already. I'll take the Piketty and Nievas one, which, you know, I think it's not a bad thing to address symptoms. I'm not saying that, you know, people should just like, you know, be dying in poverty because until capitalism ends. But the problem is that what they're proposing is likely to actually be possible because of the power dynamics of the world. So, and this is why, like, I brought in the NIO example, because I think the NIO would be fantastic as like a way to address symptoms of, you know, subordination. You know, it's an unfair financial system, it's an unfair trade system. There definitely should be an NIO even within capitalism, but it wasn't possible because of the power imbalance. And Samir Amin had a very good paper that he wrote at the time in the 70s when he was saying, you know, you can speechify about it when you know that like everyone's speechifying about it. You know it's not dangerous. It's toothless. It's a distraction. So I think that's the problem with the Piketty's and Nieves paper, that they kind of give very clear policy solutions. Oh, just reform the IMF. Oh, just create a clearing union. But it's not going to happen because of the power imbalances in the world. So therefore, it just kind of gives liberal or progressive economists a kind of way to something to talk about without actually having teeth. So I think that's the main issue there. For the U.S. trade deficit question, it's a good question, and I think, in my view, it isn't a problem. the US trade deficit because the US has world money. You were just about to talk about that, I think. So it can be financed by everyone is willing to hold dollars. And the reason Trump thinks it's a problem is because of the contradictions of empire in a way. Like there's a huge amount of poverty in the US, which needs to be addressed. It's not because of the US trade deficit. That's not the issue. But this is, even the British Empire had huge amounts of poverty at the time. It's not like being an empire necessarily gives you, wealth for everyone, huge inequalities. So I think the US deficit in a way is a distraction, like in this whole debate. It might be, it will become a problem at some point when people aren't willing to hold dollars, but we're not there yet. The big green state, great question. I think if we're going to, given what's happening in the world, we do need, green interventions. But I think anything that looks like a big green state needs to also take class into consideration and imperialism. I'm not sure, I haven't read all of Daniela Gabor's work on that, so I'm not sure kind of that specific proposal, but I know that there are people that are working on that, like Max Eil, for example, with the People's Green New Deal. So I think there are ways to connect those things. But I think in the global north, a lot of the time when we talk about the Green New Deal or big green state, it tends to actually reproduce some sort of Eurocentric problems. So that's a quick answer to that one. And then the imperialist class question, very difficult. And I didn't mean to say that, no, we should obviously organize imperialism against imperialism regardless, like Palestine, everything. It doesn't have to always connect to sort of a working class basis, but given that imperialism will always be a feature of capitalism, in the long run, there needs to be a class project. I don't think we are necessarily the people that will be driving that. So that's why, it's not easy to kind of give an answer to us about what we can do about it. Yeah.
Oui. Bien sûr que depuis un siècle, l'impérialisme a changé de physionomie. Ça serait absurde de ne pas tenir compte de cela. Il faut simplement savoir sur quel point il a changé fondamentalement. J'en retiens un qui me paraît très important parce qu'il a servi principalement à la révision des théories de l'impérialisme. C'est celui de l'interdépendance économique. Quand le PDG du deuxième groupe de la défense américaine, qui a construit le système de défense israélien, Raytheon, déclare contre Biden, enfin contre Janet Yellen, qu'il est impossible de découpler les activités de sa firme de la Chine parce que, je cite, nous avons des milliers, je dis des milliers de fournisseurs en Chine. Pour le deuxième fournisseur du Pentagone, Raytheon, derrière Lockheed Martin, on comprend le degré d'interdépendance universelle des nations, comme dit le manifeste du Parti communiste. C'est quelque chose dont il faut absolument tenir compte et qui, d'une certaine manière, est un facteur qui retient dans les conflits armés, parce que les intérêts sont partagés et donc les risques aussi sont partagés. Raytheon est-il un groupe global qui n'a plus d'attache nationale aux États-Unis? Les groupes pétroliers américains sont-ils des groupes apatrides parce qu'ils ont développé des chaînes de valeur mondiales? Les big tech dont on nous a expliqué pendant des années qu'ils étaient l'exemple même du capitalisme cosmopolite, presque libertarien, et qui surtout ne voulaient pas de régulation nationale, les big tech sont-ils aux États-Unis aujourd'hui des groupes apatrides? Je maintiens ma phrase, que les rapports socio-capitalistes demeurent des rapports territorialement définis et politiquement construits. Ça ne supprime pas tout ce que je viens de dire sur l'interdépendance universelle des nations, mais si nous perdons de vue cette résistance de la forme État, et je parle bien sûr non seulement des grands États impérialistes, mais y compris de tous ces dizaines d'États faillis, c'est le terme officiel utilisés, qui sont indispensables à la reproduction du capital international. Si nous ne comprenons pas la résistance de la forme État, nous ne comprenons pas pourquoi nous sommes en guerre.
Merci. Merci aux intervenants et à vous tous. Et passez une bonne soirée.